Hey everyone, back again. Let us finish up Guy Debord's The Society of the Spectacle, starting here with Chapter 4, The Proletariat as Subject and as Representation. Hi, I'm David. If you're new here, go check out Part 1. If you aren't new here, if you haven't subscribed and liked the video, you should do it if you found it useful, or leave a review on a podcast platform if this is where you're listening to me talk at you. And comment. I like to hear from you all. I don't have the time to respond to everyone because there are lots of comments and stuff, but I love to hear from you. It provides at least the illusion of communication between us. But you all, for those of you that do leave reviews and comments, you always leave great stuff. I always learn a lot from you. I wish I could respond to everyone, but I do pretty much see every single comment. So, even if I don't respond, just know that I have seen what you said, and I love that you offered me some of your knowledge. Yeah, so let's continue on here with Chapter 4, The Proletariat as Subject and as Representation. So in reflecting on the class struggle, Debord suggests that self-conscious humans are subjects of history, while productive progression is its object. That is, and this is just such a Marxist idea, that history progresses with economic forms of production and development. As economic conditions change, so too does society change, and then therefore so too does history change. So in the class struggle, in order for it to be properly conducted, and I think that it's, because I hadn't read this text before, but a couple weeks ago I did Walter Benjamin's The Concept of History, and these texts very much go together. Benjamin and Debord, they're very good. They're good bedfellows. They go together really well. Anyway, so it is within the class struggle then that there is an acknowledgement of injustice within this history, because the class struggle acknowledges this history as it is pushed by production, by changes in economic forms of production, and so it then acknowledges that history as we know it came about through exploitation, be it through slavery, through serfdom, or feudalism, I should say, and then through capitalism, that depends upon economic exploitation. So this is, Debord uses this to stage a conflict, stage a debate between Marx and Hegel, and this is something I think that I've recounted a few times, but for Debord, the issue with Hegel is that it's much too abstract. And this is what Marx says as well. Marx refers to Hegel's philosophy as Hegelian junk. It is essentially just armchair philosophy, not actually concerned with the actual plight of human beings. So within Hegel, world history, spirit is really his aim, which is quite abstract, where he's just interested in transformations, qua-transformations in themselves through what is said of Hegel, dialectical movement, which is not something that we find also that neatly in Hegel. But in any case, the idea there is that history moves via certain conflicts, contradictions, issues that pushes history forward, which is very abstract. Now, Marx comes along to say that, well, we can actually point to real, live forms of resistance through worker struggles, through class struggles that have pushed history. And that's what Marx does. He gives so many different examples. And really, says we don't need to delve into this abstract territory of philosophical introspection of our own place within the history of world spirit. We can actually look at real historical material events that pushed history. So as the progression would go for Marx that Debord identifies, is that this history would culminate into scientific socialism. And scientific socialism would come about through the knowledge and wealth that would be accrued through capitalism. And then people would become aware of capitalism's contradictions, its fundamental contradictions, and it would then force a sea change. It would force society and the world to adopt a new kind of economic system that he would call scientific socialism that comes about through capitalism. Capitalism is necessary for Marx. And so, however, Debord is cautious about this emphasis on science, because he identifies that science can very much be used to uphold bourgeois interests and capitalist interests as well. It can be used to expand already existing power instead of revolutionary power. So this is why Debord has an issue with utopian socialists at the time, or not at the time, well, yes, at the time, but before Debord as well, who ignore real struggles and put all their money on science essentially to end oppression. They say that, oh, well, as soon as science advances far enough, then we won't need to work anymore. As soon as we become so good with technology that we can have all our basic needs met through machines, then we don't need to work anymore. Now, Debord is not buying any of that. And that is because science and technology on their own will not oppose the current unequal system that we live within. In fact, if they are not accompanied by a change in consciousness about this system itself, then they will only uphold and maintain that system. So, as a present example, if we think about the writers' strike in the United States and elsewhere, if we think about the writers' strike, much of what I see about it is really a concern about AI, how AI is going to replace writers, which is obviously, I'm not trying to say this isn't a concern here. Of course, there is a concern there. However, this distracts from what I think is a more fundamental issue, and that is the nature of this exploitative industry in itself, where the issue is not AI. The issue is that these corporations are always seeking to cut costs, always seeking to underpay their employees in order to make the most money, which is at the core of this issue. And so AI is only a symptom, at least AI replacing writers in this case, is only a symptom of a broader issue. Now, Debord is, of course, he's indebted to Marx, but he's also prepared to critique Marx, where he even thinks that within Marx there's too much abstraction. There's too much of a removal from actual revolts that had occurred to oppose capitalist exploitation. Now, if you read Marx, you know that there are so many instances where he describes workers' revolts, peasant revolts, and everything against capitalist or feudalist overlords. But in reducing history to a class struggle, Debord suggests that Marx erases the many different economic situations and developments that had occurred, not to mention other economic systems that existed all throughout the world, and that can't be reduced to the somewhat linear sequence that Marx describes to human history as being tethered to really European forms of economic development. So Marx will just begrudgingly look at Asian markets or Asian types of production and just brand them this type of despotism and say that they are just, they're in their infancy in human history, which of course Marx is reflecting European ideals here, and he's just very much trying to uphold European values, and we see this kind of racism echoed as well in thinkers like Zizek, who's yeah, India needed to be colonized in order for it to embrace capitalism and to be freed from from its traditions, which of course is extremely messed up. But Debord identifies this in Marx, and he also suggests that Marx erases the fact that the bourgeois are a revolutionary class, just not revolutionary in the way that Marx would like, in the type of revolution that Marx wants to bring about. But Debord here is identifying that we cannot undermine the power and force of bourgeois movement and how really it opposed old systems as well. And so we have to be careful in just celebrating revolution for the sake of revolution, because revolutions have been used, historically, to maintain a status quo, to concentrate power in the hands of a few. So in a sense, the bourgeois revolution might be the last one to come from technical transformations and violence, or scientific developments alone. Proletarian revolution demands also a change in consciousness, as I said earlier. That is, we can't just rely on technology or science to just do the work in itself. So how much of theory is actually a way to erase specific instances of revolt? Do all workers experience the same exploitation? Are there degrees of exploitation? I mean, these are questions that I'm concerned with and that I think kind of run under the current of Debord's argument, especially when he considers the ways in which workers' movements, as they are taken up by certain figures as leaderheads, come to homogenize the experiences of workers in their becoming a spectacle. So, for example, the Soviets, or the Soviet Union, Soviet ideology didn't emerge from theory, but from a response to specific circumstances. So the Soviet then became, in Debord's words, the highest theoretical truth of the International Working Men's Association, which, of course, we have to ask who's actually being represented in such a movement. And so we see then, of course, there are big differences among Marxists, socialists, communists, like so many different camps here. And it isn't to say that that's bad. I mean, it's good that there are these disagreements and these conflicts. In fact, I think that's what keeps the kind of the theoretical movement certainly alive, in that it keeps these groups capable of actually defending their points and not just submitting to doctrine or dogma as though they know exactly what needs to get done and how it needs to get done. So does this come about, though, by viewing the other through a homogeneous lens, thereby ignoring specificities? So, by a counterpoint, for those who see anarchism and anarchists as not falling under the rubric of communist movements, depends who you read to some extent, does this, or I should say, anarchists are no better in that they submit to the illusion of individualism, much like communists or whatnot might submit to the illusion of the worker as just some homogenous group. So anarchists are no better in that they submit to the illusion of individuals, or the illusion of individualism, or in the case of communism, the dream of a communist utopia that just applies to all, without having or wanting to really put in the work. They can't reckon with different needs people have, their varying histories and whatnot, and the atomism essentially makes them very susceptible to manipulation. Debord is essentially dissatisfied with historical Marxist revolutionary movements for failing to change much, really, or only doing so by increasing the state's bureaucratic powers. So Debord goes so far as to say that these struggles, Bolshevism in Russia, for example, participated in the creation of modern spectacle by inaugurating the representation of the working class. So Lenin was, in his words, the most consistent defender of the concentration of dictatorial power in the hands of the supreme representatives of ideology, which is, that will certainly rub some people the wrong way, but I think that he's got a point. Whereas Stalin as well, terrorized the workers and peasantry with his bureaucratic state. In a sense, by liquidating the bourgeois, Stalin realized capital's dream, in his words, that is to give it autonomous control over the commodity economy. So the issue, just repeated again and again and again here, is of representation, where real people, real struggles are papered over, are displaced from those real people and real struggles onto someone else who stands in for those real people and real struggles. So bureaucracy always tries to hide its existence. It tries to normalize itself to such an extent that it can't be criticized, it can't be identified. And this really goes as it intensifies. So it is capitalism's preferred form of administrative control because it isn't centralized. It tries to spread itself out throughout the entire social body, something that we come to see certainly in Foucault's work, the work of others in that same vein, who are very cautious and very critical of the ways in which we come to internalize certain ways of thinking, and then by virtue of that, normalize those ways of thinking and existing in the world. So each bureaucrat knows themselves to be part of a group, but they must hide this fact to maintain their control over the workers. And he's really pointing at Stalin here. So fascism also participated. This isn't reserved for communism. Fascism participated in creating the spectacle and its erasure of history and its simple reduction of complicated phenomena like anything into just a matter of race, blood, the leader, the nation, which are in themselves, like, they are all part of the same problem. So he's identifying here between communism, capitalism, fascism. He's identifying this common insistence upon homogenizing issues and then containing those issues into image-like representations so that they can be better controlled, so that they can benefit the few at the expense of the many. So for Debord, a proper proletarian consciousness would oppose unions, parties, and state power that stand in for the workers' struggle as representation. So the working class must realize that it is opposed to all congealed externalization and all specialization of power, which, we have to ask, to what extent is this actually useful, though, I think, in that how can you actually mount any kind of effective resistance to oppression if any effort to organize is just going to, can just be written off as submitting to the spectacle? So Debord celebrates instead workers' councils and their challenge to class society, because workers' councils allow the proletarian movement to be its own product, to actually do its own work and to respond to its own needs. So this isn't totally schematized in this text, but what he is advocating for, at least what it reads like to me, is something akin to what Fanon calls for in The Wretched of the Earth to fight against colonialism, in that it is about almost individual struggle against the system in specific zones. So what you'll have is immediate people in like certain communities who are affected in a very specific way, fighting against the system that is oppressing them in their way. And so there isn't one homogeneous solution, one panacea, whatever, cure-all for the problem. Instead, it's about lots of little solutions emerging, responding to immediate needs and experiences. So councils are the working class, and so they oppose the spectacle's effort to represent the working class. So a proper revolutionary movement unites theory and practice without taking on a separate representational identity. And that'll put us here into chapter 5, titled Time and History. So of course, history has always existed, to some extent, but our version of history is very much a human phenomenon. That is the way we've created it. And we reduce history to historical time to contemplate our linear progression or to make sense of our movement through history as a species. Of course, this really just translates into European history in this context, which is obviously problematic. I mean, when history books are written, they aren't telling about indigenous histories, the varying histories of the many different indigenous nations all across North America, for example. But in any case, so here Debord presents how different societies have different relationships to time. Nomadic hunters and gatherers from thousands of years ago and early sedentary people, they lived under what he calls cyclical time because they just kept experiencing the same thing in the present. Again, if you're very curious, like a few weeks ago, I released an episode on Benjamin's The Concept of History. A lot of this is really resonates with that. So they lived under cyclical time in that they just lived in a perpetual present. With production and the accumulation of wealth, however, and resources, society, or at least those who were the best off, they were opened up to a new form of time, an irreversible time that was linear, where suddenly time was moving through space. It wasn't just like living in the same day over and over again in your immediate community. Suddenly you could look forward and plan things. It wasn't just about sustaining yourself. So this is the point where wealth is used for sumptuous feasts, adventure, and war. When the masters of cyclical society travel through their personal histories. In the earliest places, in the earliest instances, repetition and kinship were humans' ways to maintain their humanity. That is, they used kinship, ritual, and everything to make themselves feel human. Now, with the advancement of labor and production comes not the dissolution of cyclical time per se, but rather its reappropriation as an event-oriented succession of powers. Now, I think there's a few ways to understand this. I mean, for even at the level of workers, getting away from powers, people who've accumulated capital, for workers, like living under this system is certainly a repetition of the same. It feels very much like an endless cycle, not like looking to the future, but just an endless repetition of the same. Now, think as well, like historically, of the significance we place on writing here. If a society didn't write, we don't enter it into our history books historically, because we don't have records. But this isn't to say that there was anything wrong with them. Like, we place a lot of emphasis on writing and societies that have written, because those are the ones who we've added to our history books and that we always refer back to. And what this does is it gives us a very narrow conception about what humans are capable of societally within history, where we focus specifically on those ones that wrote things down. And so we are beholden to writing, and we repeat the same cycle of writing instead of imagining alternatives. So this is essentially to critique our obsession with tracing history, repeating history, which in a sense repeats very much the same over and over and over again, but under the illusion of linear progression, moving through time in history. So we can look back and say, look, we've come this far, we have these records from these old times, but all that this actually confirms for us is that we have submitted to this medium like writing, and it's become dominant for us. And writing is a kind of simulation, it's a representation in itself that removes us from engagement with one another. So ruling over history as a big spectacle is to rule over society. So new religions at the time resonated with irreversible time in their identifying an origin point, a sequence, and a judgment day, where, you might have existed in cyclical time to some extent, but if you were religious, like in the Christian tradition, Judgment Day was coming. That was something to look forward to. So conflict between cyclical and irreversible time mirrored in conflict between myth and history, where myth often being passed down orally through the oral tradition, and history being something that was written, enshrined in text. So with capitalism and bourgeois society and its logics, we see perhaps the liberation of historical time from cyclical time. At least that's the promise, and historical time and writing are imbued with a certain quality, but, we have to ask how much of liberation is really possible here. So history is now no longer reserved for the ruling classes trying to wrestle with their own histories, but is taken up by everybody, at least under globalized capitalism, which I think that he's making a big leap here, in that there are still so many societies that pass down their histories orally. They don't submit to writing or historical time in this European-centered way, but in any case, historical time under capitalism is also a time tuned to the time of things given in abundance and given their abundance. So in this, though, is revealed the worker's attachment to time as the engine that pushes time forward in production. So can there be a reclamation of this time by workers then? I mean, this is a question I'd pose to you. Like, do you think that this time can be used for people's liberation, or are we always already going to be doomed, given that this time is so neatly tied up with bourgeois logics, with logics of the oppressor and the writers of history? Now that puts us here into spectacular time, or chapter 6, spectacular time. So commodity time homogenizes time into equal intervals between objects, where humans are now seen as means to an end, not as an end in themselves. So even outside of work, people are confronted with the ghost of cyclical time, but it is illusory. In his words, pseudo-cyclical time leans on the natural remains of cyclical time and also uses it to compose new homologous, always a word I've struggled with, homologous combinations. That is day and night, work and weekly rest, recurring vacations, etc. It's like an endless cycle of the same. So in work, outside of work, we are saturated in images and pseudo-enjoyment in this world, all while trying to save as much time as possible. So the spectacle here is the false consciousness of time. A revolutionary reclamation of time withers away at the social measure of time in favor of a playful model of irreversible time of individuals, groups, a model in which independent federated times are simultaneously present. So here he's revealing his emphasis upon irreversible time, how it can be redeemed as a playful model, which is just like, whether or not that's possible, leave it up to you, but it does seem a little bit optimistic. In any case, it's a good point, or it's interesting. That brings us here into chapter 7, the organization of territory. So capitalism globalizes. Obviously, it always seeks to look for new markets, new people to exploit, new people to sell to, etc. So capitalism globalizes and homogenizes its space. This is the banalization of space. Banal, like banal. This is banalization of space. It eliminates geographical distance in favor of spectacular separation, where the separation is really an illusion because we are all united under the same system. So space here is used to isolate people, which is true of the suburbs or cities where people retreat into their own individual atomized, separated space, and they rely upon methods of communication through new technologies to actually keep in contact with one another instead of actually being around each other. Now, it makes it harder in these cases for people to actually mount any revolutionary struggle because they don't actually come together to understand the conditions of their specific local issues. They will connect with people all across the globe around spectacular or thinly veiled internet-based issues instead of those that actually deal with their immediate communities. At least, I'm reading to some extent into Debord's work. This comes way before the internet, but I think this is how he interpret the internet today. So a revolutionary idea here would be to reconstruct the entire environment in accordance with the needs of the power of the workers' council, of the anti-statist dictatorship, of enforceable dialogue. Which is not something I certainly love. The anti-statist dictatorship sounds like a horrible time. Of enforceable dialogue, of course, is the cherry on top. But yeah, I don't know. I think that there's something incredibly ironic in this, like this disdain for Lenin and Stalin on the basis of their representing people, but then being totally okay with the workers' council that will set up a dictatorship. It's like, okay, I was on board when it was just like local struggles, people responding to their local needs. But when it's like clearly then going to become a much broader enterprise, it has to, anyways, you know what I'm saying. So that puts us here into chapter 8, negation and consumption within culture. So culture is complex, and because it strives to be accepted by all, but is by nature separate and individualized, it is by nature separate and individualized to specific communities. So everyone, there's cultures everywhere, but of course it's different people have different cultures and stuff. So in his words, in this search for unity, culture as a separate sphere is obliged to negate itself. Culture is something that must be embraced by all, yet people oppose one another on the basis of culture. So here, this is kind of like a Hegelian thing he's doing here. Negation of the negation. So its negation can happen in response to one of two possibilities. The negation of culture can happen one of two ways. To embrace total history, that is a revolutionary one, or live as essentially a zombie in the spectacle. So there's two kinds of cultures here, right? The total history one, revolutionary, proletariat, total history, or essentially the spectacular one of mundane proletarian life. So all of this applies to art more specifically as a way to communicate communal identity. So in our spectacle or spectacular age, art is a means to create artificial communities in in the form of museum goers or rich people who peruse art galleries, embrace haute culture. They convince themselves that they're living the high life. And this is essentially a restructuring without community. This is just art for the sake of bourgeois culture. Now, culture always tries to seek to, as far as it represents bourgeois values, it tries to normalize this dynamic. Intellectuals as well try to normalize it as a genuine or as a general science of false consciousness, that our relationship with art, our relationship with culture, and try to make it seem as though this is the only way to have a relationship with art and culture. So these efforts work to hide the negatives and contradictions of our material world, and in order to make it seem as though there's nothing wrong with this world as it is represented and replayed in the art world or in the spectacle. And sociology, he says, does this quite well. So here, opposing the spectacle has to go beyond critique to put practical force into action. It is dialectical in that it doesn't shy away or hide what is negative in it, which I don't know if that's actually what dialectical means. I guess if you just use the term and you say that's what it means, I guess I can't say anything, but it would, I don't know if that's exactly how we should interpret it, but in any case, that's what he says. Chapter 9, Ideology Materialized. So ideologies have ended for Debord. This is kind of like what Fukuyama would come to say, the end of history, liberal democracy and global capitalism is one, that's the end of things. So the spectacle for Debord has become our one ideology. But in being universal, it is no longer an ideology, it's just all-encompassing. Which, this is also one of those things where it's like, okay, is it all-encompassing? I mean, lots of people don't. Anyways, whatever. The spectacle arrests movement because it stands in for movement itself. So the spectacle is unidirectional and so inhibits self-consciousness. It just makes us always consume the same, and we are stuck in a state of non-movement as a result. So this workers' council that he celebrates, comprised of those in tune with universal history, is our only hope against the spectacle and the means of production that the spectacle rests upon. And that's that. I mean, let me know what you think. I would really love to hear if anyone has any opinions about it. I think I made my opinions fairly clear, but in any case, there's a lot to dig into here. Like, Debord obviously offered a lot in this text, and I think that it was a very good precursor to what we would see with Baudrillard's work and others. And yeah, let me know what you think. If there's anything I got wrong or excluded, I'd love to hear about it. And on that note, or if you like what I did, like, share, subscribe, and then on that note, take care.